When beer sits in a keg, bits of yeast, hops and other particles tend to sink to the bottom, and that forms a layer of sediment. The standard Cornelius keg uses a tube to draw beer from this bottom layer, where it's most likely to pick up these particulates. On the other hand, the top of the keg holds the clearest, cleanest beer because it's furthest away from the sediment. A floating dip tube is designed to draw beer from this top layer, making sure you're getting the clearest beer possible. So, how well do they work? I'm putting this to the test by brewing up a batch of American light lager and splitting it between two kegs, one with a traditional dip tube and the other with a floating dip tube. Will the floating dip tube lead to clearer beer? Let's find out. I'm Martin Keane, and this is the Brülosophy Show. I have a lot of kegs and a lot of dip tubes. In fact, I got into the habit of shortening my dip tubes by about 1 inch to avoid pulling from the very bottom of the keg. But after using floating dip tubes in fermenters such as the Brewbuild X2, I was curious to try them in place of these long dip tubes in my kegs. And I was spurned on by Brülosophy contributor Jordan Folks, who told me
floating dip tubes will change your life.
So let's give this a shot. I've got a floating dip tube here. So basically we've got the stainless steel buoy. As a Brit, I like to call this a boy, and a bit of silicone tubing. So on one end we connect the tubing to the buoy. Would it help if I put the tubing in some hot water first? Yes, it would. Did I? No, I didn't. Okay, that's done. Now we need to get into the keg. So here is my Cornelius keg, and in here right now, that's my standard dip tube. I'm missing a piece. I've just sat there thinking, how am I going to connect this to this? And I remembered, yeah, I'm missing the actual dip tube part. So I'm replacing this long dip tube now with this little guy. Now, having installed a couple of these already, this is the hardest bit now. So I've got to put the dip tube in through the gap here and then hook this up into here, and it's a pretty tight fit. So I am going to use some hot water this time. Just warm that up. All right, so this goes into the gap. And just before I do that, the other thing you might want to check is the length. So if we consider this is going to be hooked up around about here, see the length of the dip tube? This is just a little bit longer than the length of the keg. That's good because it means that this is going to float on the top layer of the beer. So maybe it'll start up here and then it'll eventually go down. It needs to be long enough so that it has enough slack to be able to reach to the bottom here. So just a little bit longer than the serving vessel is what you want to go with. All right, let's get this in. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. So with the floating dip tube installed, just put this back on, tighten that up with a wrench, and that's it. That's all there is to it to install a floating dip tube. So now I'm going to want to test this out. And to do that, I'm going to need some beer. Brewing a 6-gallon batch today. This is intended for 5-gallon batches, but this is such a low gravity beer that that's not going to be a problem. Ingredients: the malt wheel consists of 2 things. In here I have Pilsner malt, and this makes up 80% of my grist. My 20%, that is the extremely yellow flaked corn. Let's add that in too. So bump up the gravity a little bit without adding any body. I think this is going to take 60 minutes. Going to mash for a bit, maybe 40 minutes, see where we are. So I'll be splitting this 6-gallon batch between 2 kegs, one with a regular dip tube and one with a floating dip tube. All right, hops time. I had to double check that I got the hops right because this is just a tiddly amount. But I'm using Magnum hops as my bittering hops. This is about 10 grams, that's it. I'm looking for an IBU of a whopping 12. So this is really all I need. I'm going to add this in. And I am boiling for 30 minutes. That's right, 30 minutes for a recipe that has 80% Pilsner malt. What of it? What of it indeed. I find I don't have any DMS problems with short boils with Pilsner malt. Now with 10 minutes to go, I did add half a Whirlfloc tablet, and I could see when the boil was done that that Whirlfloc tablet had really done its job. There's a lot left at the bottom of the kettle there. Now for yeast, I am using Imperial Yeast Harvest, that's L17, and I'm fermenting at 55 Fahrenheit
or 13 Celsius.
A few weeks later, the beer was done. To make sure both beers were equally carbonated, I applied CO2 pressure directly to my fermenter for about 24 hours before splitting the batch between 2 kegs. So I've freshly kegged the beers. These are straight out of the fermenter. And to try to be fair, I did swap between the 2 kegs. So about the first quarter went into the first keg, the second quarter went into the second keg, and so forth. So I'm going to start with the regular dip tube beer. Now it's super light, but definitely a little bit cloudy. Okay, now the floating dip tube had no time to settle, but see how this does, pulling from the top. Now, is that one crystal clear? Absolutely not. So I think the conclusion is test one straight out of the fermenter. It's a tie. All right, we're at about 24 hours now. Regular dip tube, start again with that. I think that may have cleared up a touch. Floating dip tube. So at this point, 24 hours in, I would expect that any sediment that's in solution would have sunk near to the bottom of both kegs now. And of course, the regular dip tube is going to pull that up first, whereas the floating dip tube is going to pull stuff off the top. So no surprise to me that there was no difference yesterday. Today, I'm wondering if there will be more of a difference. But so far, I'm not really seeing it. They're still the same. It's Friday afternoon. I'm ready for a beer. Do want to point something out. I do purge the beer that's in these lines before I do this test. So I'm not just testing the beer in the line, which wouldn't be much of a test really, would it? Floating dip tube. So is there a difference? Let's try turning them around. I gotta say, I thought 6 days in, we'd start to see a difference. And to me, neither is particularly bright. They both have a bit of a chill haze. Well, it's been 5 weeks. 5 weeks. I really want some clear beer. Let's start with the regular dip tube and then floating dip tube. Now at this point, I think the beers do look a bit clearer. I would expect that. They have been in a cold temperature in my fridge for 5 weeks. You would expect stuff to drop to the bottom, but they're still not super clear. If I turn them around, can you read think beer from these glasses? Not really. Yeah, I'd have to say with these beers in particular, my life remains unchanged. So does this mean that floating dip tubes are a bust? Well, I think with this particular beer, they've not made much of a difference. And if we think about why that is, well, first of all, how much sediment is there at the bottom of the kegs? I suspect not very much. I didn't dry hop, so there's not much hop sediment. In fact, I hardly added any hops to the beer whatsoever. I doubt there's much yeast sediment either because this is such a low alcohol beer. So I really don't think there's a lot for the floating dip tubes to deal with here. It looks like these beers both have a touch of chill haze, not much, but a little bit. And chill haze is going to be consistent throughout the top and bottom of the keg, so it doesn't matter if I'm pulling from the top or the bottom there. But I do think floating dip tubes probably have their place, and I'd like to try this again with some different beer styles. For example, a much hoppier beer. I think this would make a big difference. And also, both of these kegs have remained stationary in my house, in the fridge the whole time. But if I were to transport these kegs, for example, to take them in a car to an event, I rather suspect the floating dip tube would fare better than the long dip tube because any sediment that I have stirred up by moving the kegs would be less likely to be a problem if I'm pulling from the top. But as things stand right now, I'm not planning to replace my dozen or so kegs all with floating dip tubes just yet. That's it for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode. And until then, think beer.